Trans people have always existed. Even in ancient times, when humanity had not yet developed gender roles and norms, there is evidence of females identifying and presenting masculinely, and vice versa. However, in our current world of bureaucracy and our obsession with facts, transgenderism has been pigeonholed into deviancy by a system that refuses to acknowledge that humanity's diversity is so massive that by attempting to categorize and control what can and cannot be accepted as normal, it goes against humanity's very nature. In this video, I will cover the three main pillars of the system that was built to quash difference and diversity. And by the end of the video, I will offer a solution to this rigged system that allows people to exist as they are, while questioning the entire trans-cis dichotomy as we see it today. But before we get into that, I'll allow my interviewees to introduce themselves.
My name is Alex. I use he/him pronouns, and I identify as trans man, gender fluid person.
My name is Fern. I am a grade 10 student, and my pronouns are they, she.
My name is Griffin. I'm a high school student. Pronouns are it, its, and they, them.
My name's Melfi Diao. I'm a high school student at Etobicoke School of the Arts, and my pronouns are he, him.
I'm Yasmin Miraria Dia, trans femme fairy. My pronouns are they, fair, and she, her.
My name is Ken Zucker, and I'm a psychologist, and my pronouns are he, his, and him.
Schools are one of the most important institutions in shaping culture and general knowledge. Schools teach children what to believe about the world when their brains are at their most vulnerable to outside influence. That's why it's so important for schools to be accepting and teach kids about sexual diversity, something schools just don't do nowadays.
Sometimes you have to genuinely stop and then actually have to explain it yourself, because school doesn't teach that much about it. I remember back in grade 5 when we were doing our health unit, the papers referred to people as people with vaginas and people with penises, which is fair, but our teacher scoffed at it, which is not a very good way of showing kids that this terminology is okay, because it is okay. There was nothing wrong with it, but our teacher still scoffed at it because, I don't know, maybe she just didn't like it, maybe she didn't like how lengthy it was, but it still sends off the wrong message.
Researchers have been asking for education on these topics for years, but there is still frustratingly little being taught to children about the ways they can express themselves and the gender spectrum in general.
Discourse matters. That is, being included or not in what counts as important, non-negotiable, legitimate, and urgent in the discourses of research on teaching and teacher education matters. Gender and sexual diversity's marginal inclusion has shaped not only the trajectory of knowledge building of issues affecting LGBTQ youth in pre-K to 12 schools, but also the pathways by which that knowledge has been disseminated to broader educational communities.
The lack of an education about trans issues has measurable and devastating consequences on the lives of those who are put in severe danger by the fear surrounding their identity.
I realized that I was trans over 6 years ago, in the summer of 2016. At the time, I lived in an incredibly conservative and very religious household and environment, and it was not a religion that was accepting of trans people, violently unaccepting. So as soon as I realized that I was a woman, I realized that I had to leave. After I left home, I was homeless. I didn't have much support, so I lived in homeless shelters for a while, which were very dangerous and not very hygienic. Lived on the streets for about a year and a half.
Yasmin's plight is not a unique one. the amount of homeless trans people increased by 88% from 2016 to 2020. There are also problems within the school system with changing school documents for trans kids.
Sometimes it's just complaining about the admins at the school not being that useful for transitioning issues. Like, there are some people who just can't get their name changed in the attendance because the principal at Western Tech is not very good.
Plus, asking for people's pronouns is not normalized at other schools like it is at ESA, and there's no place on school documents for people to add their pronouns, meaning teachers will usually just assume people's gender, leaving the burden on the trans person to correct them and risk dealing with a transphobic teacher.
It was definitely hard to transition, especially in school, having to tell my teachers that I want to go by a different name and use different pronouns. And then there's also the issue of them with my report card and stuff like that. So it was really kind of a scary time.
And all of that isn't even mentioning the issues with gender-neutral bathrooms, if your school is even lucky enough to have a gender-neutral bathroom.
I think the biggest thing that bothers me is lack of access to sort of basic necessities, like even just washrooms for trans and non-binary people. For example, at my school, there's only one all-gender washroom, and it's constantly filled with other students who could be using one of the binary washrooms.
Gender-neutral bathrooms are always occupied, usually with people just vaping, and there's not really much anyone can do about that, which kind of sucks. Because I think all the gender-neutral washrooms at Western, like, basically are for one or two people. So usually it's like you just have to wait half an hour because also they're either broken or just occupied by people vaping.
With all that said, though, kids who are affected by this uncaring system have found ways to form a collective.
So I am in the Queer Trans Support Group at Western Technical Commercial School. It is run by Rex Pride and a child counselor at the school who works at the TDSP. It is just like, we all just meet at lunch. We talk about things happening in our lives. We go over everyone's pronouns, names. There's quite a lot of people in it, actually. So there's so many that we actually had to split the schedule up. So grade 9s and 10s are 1 week, then everybody, and then 11s and 12s, and then everybody again. There's that's how many people there were. And it's helpful. I get to hear other people's perspectives on transitioning. I get to think about how that relates to mine, how it might be different, what other people are going through. It's basically just a safe space to talk about your problems or just generally how you are living your life in the middle of your transition.
At my school, we have a club called Bent on Change. It's sort of our version of a GSA. And I'm a member there, and we have a good few members, and we just discuss sort of issues we have at the school, and it's sort of a safe place for us.
In conclusion, schools are an essential tool in destigmatizing gender diversity, but unfortunately they are not being used in ways that benefit trans people. Changing your legal name and sex is a huge step in transitioning that is important to many trans people. However, if you're poor or disabled, there can be massive difficulties with doing this because the system is incredibly confusing and difficult to manage.
I wish I could tell you what it was like to get my official name and my gender designation on government documents. I wish I could walk you through what that was like from start to finish, but there's a reason I haven't finished it, and it's because it's prohibitively hard if you're disabled. You have to fill out this enormous form, and you have to constantly mail documents back and forth. You have to spend a bunch of money to do it in the first place, processing fees, and then they take forever, and then you might get rejected anyway, and then you have to make absolutely sure that you check off the hidden checkbox that's like, don't publish my dead name and the name I legally changed to in the paper, otherwise they will. And there's a whole bunch of other things. So I'm going through it with a social worker and a lawyer friend of mine, but it is very difficult to do for someone who is disabled and lives alone. So I would highly recommend for anyone who's trying to do it to seek out trans-affirming social services in your area, because those will be a big help. I cannot stress how much of a hurdle it is to have to fill out like 10 plus pages of government forms, because they'll be asking for some very obscure information. A lot of these services are designed with abled people in mind, and they really often don't consider disabled people. When I went to Service Canada and I asked them how to get my name changed, they gave me the bunch of papers, and they were in such tiny fonts. And I asked if I could get them in bigger font, and they told me I'd have to pay a processing fee. Now, I'm not sure if that was just that one person who was there or that one branch or something. I'm sure that for a lot of the things that I talk about, someone could sit here and tell me, oh, that was just one person, it's against the law to do that. And I'm sure that would make the person saying that feel better. But the problem is, there's not a lot of accountability, because at the end of the day, the people who are handling these services are human beings, and their biases are allowed to get in the way far more often than not.
This speaks to an ableism that pervades all areas of bureaucracy, preventing disabled people from getting the care they need because they're being forced to maneuver through a system that was not built for them. Similarly, for trans people, even if they're not disabled, getting their name changed can be extremely frustrating because of factors outside of their control.
I'm aware of the process of legally transitioning. I know a couple people who are going through that process right now. From what I've heard from them, it seems very tedious, since a lot of them are still either on wait lists to get all the things they need, or can't just because of the situations they're in.
Firstly, you must pay legal fees of $137, which isn't exactly dirt cheap, especially if you're poor. The 17-page form you must fill out and submit is also a nightmare, requiring you to input your marital status, your parents' names, and your criminal history. If you're married, your current spouse must consent to your name change in order for it to be processed, and along with submitting the form, you will be subjected to a police record check that outlines
every criminal offense of which the person has been convicted, unless a pardon or suspension has been granted under the Criminal Records Act, every criminal offense of which the person has been found guilty and has been discharged, except if the Criminal Records Act requires that the record be purged, every offense of which the person has been found guilty and for which an adult sentence has been imposed under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, as described in Section 117 of that Act, every outstanding law enforcement order against the person. This includes warrants, prohibition orders, restraining orders, driver's license suspensions, probation orders, and parole orders, and every pending criminal charge against the person.
You also have to get a guarantor to confirm that you have lived in Toronto for the last 12 months, and the only people who can act as guarantors are outlined in this list.
1. Provincial judges appointed under the Courts of the Justice Act. 2. Justices of the Peace appointed under the Justices of the Peace Act. 3. Chiefs of Indian bands that are located in Ontario. 4. Persons authorized under the Marriage Act to solemnize marriages. 5. Legally qualified medical practitioners. 6. Members of the Law Society of Upper Canada. 7. Heads of municipal councils in Ontario. 8. clerks of municipalities in Ontario. 9. Principals of elementary and secondary schools as defined in the Education Act. 10. Managers or signing officers of Ontario branches of banks listed in Schedule 1 or 2 of the Bank Act, loans corporations, trust corporations, credit unions, and Caisse Populaires. If you can't identify anyone from this list to act as a guarantor, you must find someone other than a relative who has known you for at least 5 years and knows that you've been ordinarily resident in Ontario for at least the past 12 months.
These requirements for the only people who can confirm your residency in Ontario are extremely harsh, unless you happen to know a justice of the peace or someone of that stature. You might be saying, "No, it's easy. Just get your parents to corroborate. They've known you for your whole life." However, that argument doesn't take into account one of the most ubiquitous parts of the trans experience: parents not supporting your transition. Additionally, you might wonder why people can't just go to their doctor. But the average doctor is far more transphobic than you might expect. For more information, see the following section. So, for most trans people, they are relegated to trying to get people who have known them for that long to corroborate their residency, which can be difficult if you're isolated from social spaces, as most disabled, homeless, or mentally ill people are due to circumstances beyond their control. And if someone has immigrated to Canada less than 5 years before applying to change their name, they won't be able to. Finally, once you've filled in all of the information, have gotten relevant people to sign, and have paid the fees, you will receive your new birth certificate, complete with a new name and sex.
SpongeBob?
Hold the phone, folks. I'm getting an important news flash from Mr. Krabs. Go ahead, Mr. K.
You can't change your legal sex, you can only choose for it not to be displayed on your birth certificate? And you have to go through an entirely separate legal process for sex? And you have to do it again and again for every separate document you want to change?
Oh, for crying out loud, SpongeBob! You didn't get the job!
What?
Rather than go over the frustratingly and unnecessarily tedious process of changing your legal sex on each of those documents, I'll gesture to the process of changing your name and allow you to fill in the blanks so this video essay doesn't get too long. If you want more information on this, I'd suggest going through the linked page in my sources list that goes through the steps. This is a ton of work just to get your name and sex changed legally, and you might be wondering, well, it sucks that it's so difficult and time-consuming, but if it's really that hard, then why do people even bother? Why not just go by your preferred name and pronouns despite what your birth certificate says? People go by nicknames all the time. Does it really matter all that much? And that's a reasonable question, but the issue is it's really not that simple. For example, let's say you wanted to buy a house as a trans person. You find a place you like, you fill out all the forms, and as a part of that, you have to fill in your legal name. And that means that the person you're buying that house from now knows you're trans and can freely discriminate against you. This happens for everything people have to know your legal name for, including jobs, which has a huge impact on trans people's livelihood and ability to survive and have their needs met, that a cis person usually wouldn't even consider.
I've been given very telling reasons for why I was rejected for housing applications and such as well. And a lot of them included both my transgenderness and my blindness. And now you may say, oh, that's illegal, they can't reject you. Fuck, they sure did. They sure did. And there's not much you can do about it because it's so easy for them to make up another convincing reason.
Okay, then why not just change your legal name but not your legal sex? People don't see that on a leasing agreement or a job offering. This still doesn't work because forms of legal ID, like passports and driver's licenses, have your legal sex on them, and when you have to show it to, say, a police officer when they ask for ID, and you're presenting femininely when your legal sex is male, that can pose a real and significant risk of police brutality. Police are famously trigger-happy when it comes to minorities, especially black people and other people of color, because there are usually no repercussions for shooting and/or killing people if you're a cop. That's just the reality.
In over 25% of cases, charges against the police are withdrawn by the Crown. For the cases which do proceed to trial, the most common outcome is an acquittal, and for officers who are convicted, they are typically sentenced to a conditional or absolute discharge. 33% of charged officers were convicted, a figure which is significantly lower than the 56% overall rate of guilt for Ontarians tried within the same period of time. There are also notable differences in the sentencing outcomes of police officers. Officers tend to be sentenced less punitively for assault and driving-related offenses, and are more likely to receive non-custodial sentences than are the general public.
Therefore, the legal system is a vitally important hurdle for trans people to go through during their transition, and it is extremely difficult for the people who need it most to change their information. Trans people face a lot of problems with the medical system. So much so that this section will probably be the longest part of the video, and it still will not have even scratched the surface of all of the issues trans people have to deal with when trying to access gender-affirming care. My interviewees also had the most to say about this aspect of their experiences. I'm getting a lot of points in this section from Abigail Thorne, so please watch her video. I emailed my doctor 133 times, The Crisis in the British Healthcare System, for an incredible analysis of transphobia in the healthcare system that is far better than this brief summary of the many issues that trans healthcare has. So, without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, transphobia among doctors is a significant problem, and the medical system's complete trust placed on the doctor's knowledge of trans people over their own knowledge of themselves means that doctors can just deny trans people the medical care they need without any consequence.
I guess the immediate one is my friend whose doctor is transphobic and wrote an article about being transphobic.
A lot of the trans friends I have who have issues with things like the healthcare system or school, one of the main things is that they find it hard to get people to refer to them by the name and pronouns that they want. So that can be whether by teachers or doctors or nurses. It's sort of a all-around problem with society as a whole.
When I first started transitioning, I was researching, right? I was researching ways to maybe start gender-affirming care. And I still live in Niagara, and I went to my family doctor, and I told him about it. I was like, hey, could I maybe receive some gender-affirming healthcare? I think I'm transgender, female to male. And he was surprised. He ordered a genetic test. He wanted to see if my chromosomes were in line, if I was intersex. That could maybe explain why I wanted to transition. And by the end of it, my doctor outed me to my parents at the end, and that was probably one of the worst times of my life. And that started not a long history, but a period of depression.
It took me years to even be seen, to even be considered for HRT, and this is something that varies wildly from city to city. Here in Toronto, we have it much better than where I was in Windsor, although I hear it's getting better there. But then you had the issue of when they saw me, they needed me to jump through a bunch of hoops. I had to get a note from a psychiatrist. I had to be involved in the local trans community for at least 6 months. This was all before the endocrinologist would even consider seeing me. And then after that, And this was all after years of even trying to get them to consider seeing me in the first place, to talk to me. And after I did all of that, they put me on dosages that barely did anything. And I don't mean at the start. They always start with like a little bit to, test the effects on your body. But they were planning to keep me on dosages that barely did anything very long term, because they wanted to keep it reversible, which is it's a distressingly common and transphobic idea in a lot of medical practices, even to this day, even in Canada, even in Ontario, where they're not actually concerned with safety so much as reversibility a lot of the time. And of course it depends very heavily on the practitioner that you're seeing. So eventually I switched to a different endocrinologist, and then later on I came here to Toronto. And things have been better here. I will say it is still, even to this day, it is very hard to get dosages upped for this for any reason. And so there really was and is just this stigma that pervaded my entire experience and continues to pervade my entire experience trying to get hormone replacement therapy.
This is particularly troubling because the evaluation process for gender-affirming treatments is much more extensive than that of other surgeries or procedures.
There's a lot of transphobia ingrained within the medical system to the point where other people can use body-enhancing drugs for all sorts of things, for sports, or just cis people can get access to hormones so much more easily to treat so many things. But the moment you say that you want hormones for trans-related purposes, they suddenly have to be 100% sure. And what that really meant for my experience was instituting a bunch of hoops you had to jump through. I have a much easier time getting my antidepressant dosages upped than my hormone dosages upped. And let me tell you, antidepressants in a lot of ways are much more dangerous than hormones.
Often, cisgender doctors will be put in charge of judging whether an individual trans person should have the right to medically transition, based on criteria that was written by cisgender psychologists and for the express purpose of treating transness as a mental illness, and administered by doctors who were not required to go through any training for being able to diagnose gender dysphoria, have not been taught anything about what being trans involves in general, and have likely never even spoken to a trans person before. Why are we trusting that these cis doctors know anything about the struggles of trans people, let alone that they are able to evaluate someone's need for gender-affirming surgery without bias?
Today, negative encounters with physicians lead to us LGBTQIA+ people to avoid seeking healthcare, and many physicians report feeling underprepared in treating LGBTQ+ patients. Although medical educators in Canada and the United States have acknowledged the need to prepare trainees to provide LGBTQ+ patients with informed, compassionate care, medical education in Canada, related to the health of LGBTQ+ patients, remains sparse and inconsistent.
The vast majority of mental health professionals have no experience working with gender dysphoric or trans clients. So therefore, there aren't a lot of people who are specialists in this area. And so sometimes families have to look around to find somebody who is comfortable working with their kid. And as more and more adolescents are identifying in the gender spectrum as something other than cisgender, waiting lists can be pretty long. And so one way to work on the systemic issue is for there to be more training of mental health professionals so that there's a larger pool of potential clinicians who can see transgender adolescents.
Even if a trans person is lucky enough to find a good doctor, they still face significant challenges when attempting to access gender-affirming care. One of these challenges is the requirement for minors to obtain both parents' permission to medically transition, which has its own issues and inconsistencies.
You have to get both parents to sign on name changing. You have to get both parents for a lot of transitioning, like medical transition things, and that's just a problem because one, what if you don't have two parents? Two, what if one of your parents don't want to sign?
And that's not even mentioning the wait lists.
You have to be above 18 or older to receive trans healthcare. And I believe the only other trans youth healthcare is Sick Kids. And I tried Sick Kids, and they have a 1-year wait list, and I'm still on that wait list. I went through a whole nother doctor before I even got started. So the amount of wait lists in Ontario healthcare system and just the lack of widespread trans youth healthcare is really difficult to hear.
And the accessibility issues.
I think one of the biggest systemic barriers is lack of information, because I had to do some digging to find information about trans healthcare in Ontario.
And the fact that gender dysphoria is even a diagnosable mental illness. What do you mean? Gender dysphoria is what makes trans people trans. Here I will show a section of the aforementioned video by Abigail Thorne that explains the issues with that term far better than I ever could.
As we've seen by now, medical transition in England, and let's not forget a lot of legal transition as well, hinges on first being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is supposedly the feeling of discomfort that arises when there is a disconnect between the sex you were assigned at birth and the gender you are. And I think that this concept, as it is used in the NHS system, is a complete crock of shit. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle tells a story about a guy who goes to Oxford and asks to see the university. And they show him the colleges and the libraries and the quads. And at the end of the day, he says, "Yes, but where's the university? You haven't shown me that." And he's made a mistake, what philosophers call a category error. He thinks the university is its own building, but it's not. It's just the sum of all those ordinary buildings. A lot of people talk about dysphoria as if it was its own extra feeling, and I think that that too is a category error. I don't think it is an extra feeling. I think it's just the sum of... And cis people also feel all those feelings. Maybe not about the same things or to the same intensity, but they do feel them. If a cisgender woman goes through menopause and thinks, "Oh, my body feels bloated, it doesn't feel like my own, I'm anxious and depressed," is that not gender dysphoria? If a cis man is skinny and can't grow a beard and looks at his peers and thinks, "Oh, I should be manlier," is that not gender dysphoria? If a cisgender woman has hair on her face and thinks, "Oh, I've got a moustache, I look like a man, I want to get laser hair removal to get rid of it," is that not dysphoria? I think the only plausible answer here is yes. But when cis people feel those feelings, it doesn't have its own clinical label. And they don't have to be diagnosed with it to get treatment. Remember, if a cis woman goes through menopause, she can get estrogen from her GP. If a trans woman wants it, we have to go to the gender clinic and be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. When we feel those feelings, it's treated differently. And you might be saying, well, when cis people feel those things, that's body dysmorphia, not gender dysphoria. It is a different thing. But that's what I'm asking, why is it different? To which the only answer is, well, because you're trans. And that's exactly my point. Functionally, in the English clinical system, gender dysphoria just means the thing that trans people have. And in that case, you might as well just call it mad disease. I have a theory about what's really going on here. And to explain it, I want to draw on some philosophy of disability. In her book, The Capacity Contract, philosopher Stacey Clifford Simplican compares two different ways of thinking about what it means to have a disability. One is the so-called medical model. You have a disability if you have a medical problem. And the other is the social model. You have a disability if, for example, you use a wheelchair and your building doesn't have a ramp. The problem isn't your body, the problem is that the building wasn't designed by you. Simplican says that the medical model can be very appealing to able-bodied people because it soothes our anxiety. I don't want to think about the fact that society is unfair, or that the systems I'm part of exclude people. I definitely don't want to think about the fact that I could acquire a disability and then I'd be the one who is excluded. So the medical model allows me to imagine that there is a very distinct line between them and me. A line that is located in their bodies where the problem is. And that also presents an obvious solution. Get them out of here! I think that gender dysphoria does a similar thing. Because here's the real secret of the universe. If you want to change sex, it's possible. For all of human history, we've had this divide between men and women. But if you want to cross that divide, if you want to transcend it entirely and be neither, it's possible. In particular, hold in one hand all of masculinity. Thor, Leonidas, Beowulf, James Bond, Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, all of them. And in the other, hold just 2 milligrams of estrogen a day and tell me which one is more powerful. We live in a culture that valorizes men, treats them as the default. But when you're a trans woman, you can take all of that and just... and you can be happier for it.
In a male-dominated gender hierarchy where it is assumed that men are better than women and that masculinity is superior to femininity, there is no greater threat than the existence of trans women, who, despite being born male and inheriting male privilege, choose to be female instead. By embracing our own femaleness and femininity, we in a sense cast a shadow of doubt over the supposed supremacy of maleness and masculinity.
I think that some cis people are made a little bit anxious by that. I think they like to imagine that male and female are naturally occurring, stable categories and that we are just the exceptions that prove the rule. I think they like to imagine that there is a clear line between us and them. And the concept of gender dysphoria draws that line. It locates the problem within our bodies and also creates a class of specialists who can patrol that line and decide who gets across. In my opinion, the concept of gender dysphoria pathologizes transness, so people can avoid the endearing truth that there is no line, and that really we aren't so different. And so that some of them can avoid asking themselves the big question. Given that human beings can change sex, do you want to?
So, we can see that even the idea of trans people as measurably distinct from cis people is a fiction perpetuated by the patriarchy in order to get people not to question their own place on the gender spectrum. And when that idea is the basis of the medical system's understanding of trans people, it inevitably leads to the denial of trans people's legitimacy. To overcome these issues, there is a dire need for a complete reformation of the medical system for the express purpose of prioritizing trans health. This includes requiring education about trans people for doctors to receive their medical license, eliminating gender dysphoria as a diagnosis entirely, and making it far easier for trans people to access gender-affirming hormones and surgery. It is absolutely imperative that we trust trans people to know what is best for themselves and to learn from them and seek to help when they tell us they are suffering, rather than deny that their suffering exists and matters. By addressing this suffering, Healthcare providers can ensure that trans individuals can receive the same level of care and respect as anyone else seeking medical care. In conclusion, trans people face a lot of barriers when trying to align their external circumstance with their internal knowledge. Within the various systems that process trans people, there are severe roadblocks and inhibitors that prevent trans people from living their lives as they see fit because of the patriarchy's need to assimilate trans people out of existence and to manufacture a reality within which both biological sex and gender are entirely binary. In reality, of course, these concepts are far more nuanced than politicians would like to believe, and the intersections between the purely biological sex and the purely sociological gender are complex, layered, and extend far beyond the way society conceptualizes them today. This subject is extremely pertinent to current politics, as trans people have become an easy scapegoat for politicians to point at and say, "This is the problem with society." Trans exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, are dominating the political discourse by claiming that trans women are rapists and pedophiles, and people like J.K. Rowling, who have huge platforms, are using their wide reach and influence to spread hate towards the people who have suffered for decades trying to carve out a space for themselves. Trans people deserve to be accepted and trusted by society when they tell people who they are. Trans people deserve to inhabit bodies they can be comfortable in. Trans people deserve to live.